Well, survival. That's the big topic that we're here to talk about this evening. As mankind looks to the future, we certainly do face some very big survival challenges that basically come down to how to provide food, clean water, and energy to an ever-growing population on a planet undergoing climate change. Charles Mann has written an engrossing book about these challenges, but not with the purpose of providing his answer to how we all should cope. Rather, he has very engagingly and helpfully framed the debate by writing about two 20th century scientists who, though not particularly well known, were exceptionally influential. Charles says the two were largely responsible for creating, quote, the basic intellectual blueprints for understanding our environmental dilemmas. Now, these two didn't agree. In fact, they took radically different approaches to the issue of survival. One was Norman Borlaug, a Nobel Prize winning agronomist who developed high-yield wheat varieties and championed agricultural techniques that led to the Green Revolution, vastly increasing world food production. The other was William Vogt, an ornithologist who studied the relationship between resources and population and wrote the 1948 bestseller Road to Survival, a founding document of modern environmentalism that predicted trends then would lead to overpopulation and mass hunger. Borlaug and Vogt represents two sides of a dispute between what Charles calls the wizards, who believe that science and technology will enable humans to continue prospering, and the prophets, who warn of disaster unless we accept the Earth's resources are limited and cut back accordingly. Now, Charles is a journalist, a correspondent for the Atlantic, Science, and Wired, who is focused on science, technology, and commerce. And as a journalist, he doesn't appear to side with either of his biographical subjects. But he is a skilled storyteller, as he showed in a couple of his previous books, 1491 and in a companion volume, 1493, about the age of Columbus immediately before and after the discovery of the Americas. And reviews of his new book, The Wizard and the Prophet, have praised not only his lively narrative style, but also his ability to make complicated subjects accessible. Bill McKibben, the prominent environmentalist, wrote in a New York Times review that Charles's book, quote, provides detail enough and simplicity enough that anyone who is struggling with these puzzles will be enlightened and informed and entertained, which, given the subject matter, is no small feat. Now, Charles will be in conversation with Scott Stossel, the editor of The Atlantic, a magazine that Scott first joined in 1992. Scott also is the author of a biography of Sargent Shriver and of the best-selling My Age of Anxiety, which Scott spoke about here at P&P 3 years ago. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Charles and Scott.
Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you, Charles, for joining us tonight. I've just taken off my jacket because I'm a heavy sweater, but also because this is a heavy topic, future of the survival of the species.
Possibly might have some laughs, maybe?
Yeah. But I wanted to, and let me pull out my... so I've been a reader and fan of Charles Mann's books for 25, 30 years at this point. So it's a real privilege and a pleasure to sit here and talk to you all about the book and to talk to Charles, as it has been to actually excerpt the book and I'm going to give it a little plug for The Atlantic, in the current issue of The Atlantic, which will be out in a few days. We published a very nice extract from the book. This will not translate well on TV if you're looking at this on C-SPAN, but trust me, this reward, it's got a Where's Waldo quality to it that will reward close scrutiny. And without further ado, let me start right in. So you begin the book as you actually begin the excerpt of our article by talking about an anecdote when your daughter was born, some couple decades ago.
20 years, yeah. Almost 20 years.
And you walk out from the hospital and have certain thoughts. Talk about that.
Well, if any of you are a male who has had children, you know that there's this entire industry that exists to try to convince you that you have something to do with the childbirth. And so they make you go to these classes, and then you go to the childbirth, and then there, at least in my experience, there's a whole platoon of people who are constantly telling you how important it is that you're there and how very, very vital you are to what's going on. And then at the end, after the child is born, ideally everything's right, they throw you out because the people who have actually done something need to have some rest. And so inevitably this is at 3 o'clock in the morning. And so this was February in Massachusetts, and I was standing in the parking lot sort of blown away by what had just happened. And then a thought popped into my head that when my daughter was born, there'd be almost 10 billion people in the world. And I thought, whoa. And of course I'd known this before, but maybe I had more skin.
Eventually be 10 billion people.
Yeah, eventually, yeah. When she was my age, I'm sorry, excuse me, when my daughter was, when she became my age, there'd be about 10 billion people in the world. And I think centuries from now, when people look back at the time that I've been alive and many of you have been alive, the big event that they're going to talk about, historians, is that hundreds of millions of people in Asia and Latin America and, to a lesser extent, Africa, pulled themselves from out of destitution into something like the middle class. So not only will there be 10 billion people, but a whole lot of them will be middle class. And they'll want all the things we want, you know, a nice bookstore, nice black jacket, occasional treats. At one point I was going to call the book Toblerone for 10 billion. But I thought that was a great title, but my editor vetoed it. And so then these 10 billion people, they're going to want all this stuff, right? And so how are we going to provide it? You know, how's that going to work? And as Scott mentioned, I'm a science journalist, and you know, from time to time after that, when I would talk to people, we'd hit it off. We'd have a cup of coffee afterwards. I would say, hey, listen, you know, in 2050, I'd have explain my little idea. What are we going to do? And after a while, I realized the answers that they were giving me fell into these two broad categories. And they also kept mentioning these names, Borlaug and Vogt, and who I had sort of vaguely heard of. And then after a while, I thought, you know, this is pretty interesting what they're saying. Somebody should write a book.
I have to point out, and I don't know if this is not going to be visible to any of you from far away or on TV, you anticipated my next question, which, did you really actually almost call this book Toblerone for 10 billion? It's right here. Someone here up close up.
Well, I thought that was like a great title. And not going to defend myself.
But actually, the reason I wanted to ask you about that, I had a specific reason, not just because it's a silly title, because it's actually a very apt title. And it would be cryptic. But it's not just about, so one of the core theses of your book is that one of the factual bases for it is that you know, not that long from now, 20, 25 years from now, there will be 10 billion people in the world. And a significantly larger number and percentage of them will be middle class than in the past. And it's not like they want to just survive, although of course they do. They want to eat in the manner in which we, residents of upper Northwest Washington, are accustomed to eating.
Right. And why wouldn't they?
And why wouldn't they? Right. So talk about. I mean, this is kind of the core thrust of your book.
So then the question is, how are we going to do this? Because, you know, it's one thing to keep 10 billion people alive at a very low level. It's another thing to provide it with Toblerone. You know, and the reason I thought actually that was a great title, although I apparently am in the minority on this. Because you're the second editor, it's called it a silly title.
No. It's exactly apt.
That's literally the word my editor said.
It's exactly apt.
Charles,
just nobody will understand what it means.
Right.
But yeah.
Is that environmental books and books on this subject. I have a whole raft of them, and obviously they appeal to a certain number of people, but for an awful lot of people, including sometimes me, they sort of seem like homework. They seem like, exactly what you don't want to read. And so here I was, published this big fat, it's clearly book with this big fat subject that was going to be all about everything most people don't want to read. And I sort of hope that if I called it something silly, not actually, but that maybe it might hint that it might be actually interesting.
Or people might think it was a book about chocolate distribution.
Which I think that would be good.
It could be.
In fact, one point, I wrote this book, 1491, and it had New Revelations of the Americas Before Columbus was the subtitle, and I went to my editor and I said, I'm worried that people will think that this is a spiritual New Age book. And he said, your point is?
Well, let's get to the thematic core of the book, which you've sort of alluded to. But it's called The Wizards and the Prophets, or The Wizard and the Prophet. You have a specific stand-in in each case. Who are the wizards? Who is the actual wizard? Who are the prophets? Who is the prophet? And why should we care?
Well, what these guys did, again, this is basically because I would talk to these people and I realized that these answers fell into these two broad categories, and then these two names kept coming up. One of them is Norman Borlaug, and what he is the man who's the primary figure in what's been called the Green Revolution, which is the combination of high-yielding seeds, high-intensity fertilizer and irrigation that doubled, tripled, or even quadrupled grain yields across the world in the 1970s and 1980s. And if you were around during the 1960s, it was quite commonly believed that there would be massive starvations, hundreds of millions of people would die in famines, and that didn't happen. And one big reason for that was the Green Revolution, this enormous increase in harvests. And so he has become the emblem for the idea that science and technology, properly applied, will allow us to produce our way out of these questions. It'll say, be smart, make more. We can, harness these forces, and we can just simply cruise on as we've been doing.
Talk about the prophet.
Okay, the prophet is William Vogt, who's a much more obscure figure, and he is the guy who first put together the fundamental ideas of the environmental movement. He put them in this book, The Road to Survival, which is the first modern "we're all going to hell" book, if you know what I mean. And so if you read Silent Spring, or Al Gore's first book, Earth in the Balance, or Population Bomb, or The Limits to Growth, or any of these kind of classics that many of us had to read in college, all of their ideas stem from him. And he is the guy who first took a concept that had been floating around ecology for a few years at that point, called carrying capacity. And that's the idea that an individual environment can only support so much, so that if you have a meadow, only a certain number of horses can graze on it before they eat up all the grass and the meadow won't be productive anymore. And he said the earth has a carrying capacity. And this is called now a bunch of different names, ecological limits, planetary boundaries. But the basic idea is that there are these natural cycles, natural resources, and if we consume too much of them, we're going to wreck the whole thing, and very bad consequences will follow from that. And if you think about it, these two answers are kind of the opposite from each other. One is saying make more in a smart way, and the other is saying so that way everybody can win. And the other one is saying no, hunker down and conserve, and that way otherwise everyone will lose.
And this is part of what makes Charles's book such a brilliant sort of explanatory framework for understanding these things. But here's something I'm going to keep coming back to, and I'm going to start right now. You are assiduously careful in the book not to come down on one side or the other.
I'm trying to be fair.
I know you want to be fair, but we also want to we want our grandchildren to be able to eat in 2050.
Right.
So why are you so? Which side is right?
Well,
I'm going to ask you this 7 times before this is over.
Right. Well, well, you're just going to disappoint because in a certain way the answer is I don't know. It's because that involves predicting the future. And if there's one thing that I have learned I am terrible at, it is predicting the future. I mean, everything that has happened in the last 20 years of American politics, nope. Donald Trump's going to be president. Nope. Everything. So
you'd be in good company there.
Yeah. If I predict it, it's going to be wrong. So So I've been burned by this. So I'm much stronger ground saying what I see around me. Okay, and which is that there's these two alternative approaches, and both of them involve big leaps into the unknown.
Yeah.
And both of them are fundamentally based on the life we want to lead, rather, at the bottom, rather than some sort of practical consideration. And so when you think about energy, how we're going to supply energy for everyone, what the wizards want to do is have big centralized facilities, typically with nuclear power. And they'll give you all these sort of practical reasons for it. But what they really like about it is that you have everything concentrated in one place. It feeds out to everyone else, and only a small number of people have to be involved in it, and it sort of maximizes personal liberty for everybody involved. Whereas what the prophets like, are these sort of networked, small-scale solar and wind installations that are under neighborhood control, and they see this as a much more democratic way of living. But when these discussions happen, the prophets will say to the wizards, "Oh, you don't know how to deal with the waste. You don't know how to, they're way too expensive." The wizards will say, "Oh, it's so complicated and networking that we don't know how to do this." And all of these arguments are both true and sort of bogus, because what they're really about is, I don't want to live the way you want to live.
That's a good answer. I'm gonna keep coming back at you with this again and again, and you'll keep not fundamentally answering, but I hope in a way that will be helpfully elucidating.
Well,
no. In particular, so here's the next question. So isn't there a middle ground? I mean, because you're talking about you've got the wizards and the prophets. They each have different, and maybe the reason is, and maybe I'm anticipating your answer, they've got different value systems. But why isn't the answer? The prophets would say we need value system adjustments. We need lifestyle adjustments. We need to live differently. We cannot continue to live as we have been and expect that the earth will survive and that we will survive. The wizards say, again and again, technology has come to the rescue. There'll be some breakthrough, like Norman Borlaug in the 1960s with the Green Revolution. We'll do it again. Can't it be a little of both? We'll have some technological breakthroughs. We'll adjust at the margins, or maybe not so much at the margins, and we'll all be fine?
Well, there's like no law of physics that's saying that. So the answer is, of course, yes, there can be a little of both. But it's interesting that these people have been fighting for decades, and it just hasn't shown up. And so, it's a little bit like saying, to Republicans and Democrats, can't we all just get along? And the answer is, of course we can, but it doesn't seem likely to happen. Yeah.
So you divide the dwindling resource challenges that the world faces into, I think, 4 categories, and they're more than that. But if you construe them broadly: water, food, energy, and then climate change, which is sort of a different category.
I have this sort of cheesy schema that I have. The 4 elements. So Earth is...
You cheat because you have climate change as the 4th.
Yeah, but it's air. Yeah. So, Earth, air, fire, and water. So Earth is agriculture, water is fresh water, fire is energy supply, and then air is climate change.
But let me put you on the spot and rank order those in terms of the threat that they pose to the planet and to your and my and all of our grandchildren, and their generational peers, in particular in where all these new people are going to be coming from in Africa and Asia, in terms of their ability to not just survive but thrive.
Okay. Well, water is the most immediate. I mean, they happen on different scales. I mean, I don't know if you guys have been following the news out of Cape Town, where Cape Town is literally running out of water. And a whole lot of that has to do with really stupid management and issues that we can talk about if you want to. But that's actually quite immediate. There's places like Jordan that are really seriously in trouble. So that's the most immediate. I also think it's lickable, but it's very definitely an immediate problem. And then I would say food comes after that in terms of scale and time. And then for your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren, it's climate change. So it depends on when you're asking.
So it's basically a timed out over the time.
Yeah. For Cape Town, they're not worrying about climate change right now.
They're trying to get water.
Right. 0 day is happening in next month, I think it is. Yeah. When they believe it'll literally run out of water.
What are the most on each side? There are kind of gee whizzy solutions. They're probably more gee whizzy in the conventional sense on the wizard side. And in the excerpt that we published in the Atlantic, it's about C4 rice, which is about rice that has been its ability to photosynthesize has been genetically modified. But on both sides, including the private side, what are the most radical solutions, like the technological moonshots, Manhattan projects on the wizard side, and the kind of what are the things that we could do that would, maybe radically change how we live as humans on this earth that would actually make it so that we can be assured that our children and grandchildren are okay?
Well, there's a bunch of them. In fact, I sort of wrote this whole book about them. But for example, the C4 Rice Initiative, which I described both in the Atlantic and here, is this amazing project. It's largely funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And it's an attempt to change the way photosynthesis works in rice. And this is really serious genetic engineering. Most genetic engineering involves taking one to small number of genes from some organism and just essentially inserting them into another organism. And the classic example, this sort of paradigmatic example, would be Roundup Ready soybeans, in which there's a gene from a bacteria that was found in a waste pond in Louisiana that is inserted into soybeans, and you can spray Monsanto's popular herbicide Roundup on these soybeans, and they won't be killed, and so you can kill the weeds, but not the herbicide. And that's typical genetic engineering. What the C4 Rice Initiative bears the same resemblance to that a Boeing 787 does to a paper airplane. It's just an enormously grander thing, and whereas the Monsanto people are basically doing this so they can sell their goop, their Roundup, this is being done to be given away. There's no profit motive involved. And what they want to do is...
Because it's a nonprofit. It's based in the Philippines, right?
It's based in the Philippines with this organization called the International Rice Research Institute and directed by people in Oxford. And that was an offshoot of the work that Borlaug did in the 1950s and 1960s. And what they're trying to do is take probably 30 or 40 genes that are sleeping in rice and wake them up and change the way it actually grabs carbon dioxide out of the air and to make it much more efficient. And so this is really tinkering with the heart of life. And if you're the sort of person who doesn't like GMOs, genetically modified organisms, this is like going exactly in the wrong direction.
And what do you say to that? I mean, that was my next question, actually. Like, this is genetic modification
Squared,
yeah. Is that a priori a bad thing? Is it a priori a good thing? I'm making this easy for you. Or how do we think about this?
Well, I think the people who don't like genetic modification, basically what they don't like is industrial agriculture and the kind that we have, with what they call industrial monocultures, with these huge huge expanses of single crops, tended by huge machines in essentially empty countryside that has been completely depopulated. And they just don't like the whole thing. They see that as a problem, and it certainly has caused enormous environmental problems. And so for them, the idea of trying to prolong it and to extend it and make it even grander is like trying to put out a fire by pouring gasoline on it. It's exactly the wrong thing to do. And so the prophets say, instead, why don't we have farms that much more mimic natural ecosystems and change the mix of crops that we grow? For instance, we could grow trees and tubers, which are much more productive than grain, and reconfigure the way that we do agriculture in a way that doesn't cause the environmental problems associated with industrial monocultures. And the wizards say, oh, that's a complete recipe for going backwards.
Because why?
Productive. We won't be able to grow enough food, and this is it, and it's going to tie up all these people working there because these farms are much more complicated. Nobody wants to work on farms. It's horrible work. You're romanticizing agriculture, and it's not fun, and so on. So that there's a real difference of opinion about what's desirable here.
And I told you I'd ask you this question 7 times, so this is, I think, the 3rd time. Who's right?
Well, what do you like? I mean, the only way that the profits vision will work is if a certain number of the people, we now have like 2.5% of the Americans working on farms. In the book, I compared 2 farms that are side by side. One is the sort of wizard's farm, one is the sort of prophet's farm. And the wizard's farms, grows genetically modified corn, genetically modified wheat, and is 1,200 acres, and it has only 1.5 people working on it, and $2 or $3 million worth of farm equipment.
That sounds pretty good.
Yeah. Well, if you hate farming, right?
I don't hate farming, but yes.
No. I mean, if you don't, the other one has 527 acres, grows 1,000 different varieties. Huge numbers of different crops. It's an incredibly complicated system, and it has 11 full-time employees and 30+ part-time employees. The two guys here are the farmer and his son, both of them with high school degrees. Over there, they have 2 people with master's degrees in agronomy because the system's so doggone complicated. And if you want to go here, you're going to have to convince people to live here, and that means you're going to have to raise prices somehow. You're going to have to either subsidize that labor or raise prices or do something so that makes it attractive for people to live here.
But Farm A versus Farm B is question number 4. So Farm A being the wizards, Farm B being the prophets with the 11 employees, which produces more output?
It's actually, this is incredibly complicated. And this is the sort of thing, there's a zillion studies, and all the people fight about it because for instance, in terms of just sheer pounds, the organic one, quote unquote organic, produces more. The Profits Farm produces more, but because there's so many different crops, they have a lot more water in them. So do you count the water? Do you do this? If you count the water, they probably produce less, but they also use many fewer farm chemicals. So the inputs don't count as much. So the cost to produce that less. And then they also point out that it has less erosion and so forth.
The externality, it's a complicated thing, yeah.
Whereas these guys are supported by this. So it turns out that you can really spend a long time fighting about this. And that's exactly what numerous academics have done.
And the answer is we don't know.
The answer is we don't know, right. Because to expand either one on the kind of scale that's necessary to feed the 10 billion is a big leap in the dark.
So tell the story. You have a anecdote in your book about being in a coffee shop when the great, I think late biologist Lynn Margulis comes in.
She lived in my town. She was a famous microbiologist, and she won every award.
Tell that story.
This
is germane to your argument.
Right. She basically thought I was a sentimental sap. Nice. But but
sentimental saps are usually very nice.
Yeah, right. And so I was reading Al Gore's book about climate change, and finally got around to reading it. And she taps him on his shoulder, and I sort of crouch because Lynn is the sort of person who liked to poke you, and I think she liked me, but she also really liked to watch me squirm. And apparently you do too. And I apparently attract it. It's just really.
Because you're very good at laying out positions and then and very sort of existing in a kind of equipoise between the two of them.
I think that's a nice way of saying I'm wormy in your opinion. But anyway, so she taps me on the shoulder. She grabs the book, and she doesn't say anything, but she has this very eloquent look of disdain on her face. And I say, well, what? The way you would. And she flips, and there's like a picture of an endangered polar bear or something there, and she sort of rolls her eyes and goes, huh, mammals. And and the reason was that she thought this was that she's a microbiologist, and she knows that bacteria and protists and fungi and algae, the micro world makes up 99% of the world's biomass, and 99% of the world's evolutionary creativity. And mammals like us, from that point of view, we're an epiphenomenon. She thought we were cute, but not actually important. And, so, are you all worked up about endangered species? She once said to me, So I feebly tried to defend myself, right? And I said, Lynn, don't you think it would be sad if, we wiped ourselves out through climate change? And she said, you know what? It's the fate of every successful species to wipe itself out. And what she meant was that if you think about it, what Darwin's rules are, the evolution is that it applies to everything. That we are the same rules, biological rules apply. We're not special. She would also say, "Oh, you think we're special?" and we're not. We're just one species, among all the others. All the rules apply to us. We're not special. And if you put a bunch of protozoa in a petri dish, There's no predators, nothing keeping them in check, and they'll just eat the goo, on the bottom, the nutrients, and expand, and then they'll hit the edge of the petri dish, and then bad things will happen. Either they'll drown in their own wastes, or they'll run out of resources, or both. And that's what successful species do. When zebra mussels come into American rivers, they expand and expand and they expand, like the Hudson River, and they become 99% of the biomass in the Hudson River, and then they crash. It isn't like the zebra mussels say, oh, we're going to run out of food, we better stop reproducing so quickly and eating so much. They just go right to the edge. And so people are going to do the same thing, and we should just stop whining about it. That was her,
Well, this is another potential title for your book. Could have been The Edge of the Petri Dish.
Yeah, no, I thought about that too. There's many ideas, and they were all shot down by people like you. Well, Scott is actually a wonderful editor, but I am enjoying the chance to, feebly attack him. But
well, so actually, so your encounter with Lynn Margulis actually gives us an opportunity to kind of take it to a higher, sort of almost biological. We're already at a biological level, but a theological, evolutionary level. And I know you in the book, and actually in a piece that you have forthcoming in another online journal, you talk about sort of the debate between Wilberforce and Darwin,
and Huxley actually,
and Huxley, between sort of religion and that sort of idea that man is in some way substantially distinct in a way.
Special, I think is the word you're looking for.
Special, yes. Versus the idea that, no, the stuff of man is the stuff of flatworms and amoebae and zebras and giraffes, all of which are beautiful in their own way. But I think, and I may be garbling this, but it was Wilberforce, I think, who said, look, if you buy this argument, aren't we just saying that men and women, humans, are just a bunch of overachieving mushrooms?
Yeah, that's exactly what he said. This was a famous debate. If you take biology, 101, as I did, somewhere along the line you'll hear about the Wilberforce-Huxley debate, which occurred 6 or 7 months after Darwin published The Origin of Species. And there was a meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science in Oxford, and Bishop Wilberforce, who was a prominent English bishop at the time, and T.H. Huxley, who was one of Darwin's most dogged defenders, had a clash. And the debate itself is actually, as these things are, basically turned into an exchange of name-calling, not a substantive debate. But and it's sort of disappointing because your textbook will tell you what a great debate it was, and then you read about it and it's like nothing. But it became nonetheless this important event, and it's taken in the textbooks to be this time when the wars between science and religion began. And if you read the accounts, typically they say that science won, and Christopher Hitchens, the famous atheist, and many other things would like to write about, what a dunderhead the bishop was, and how smartly Huxley dispatched him. But the interesting thing is that what Wilberforce was saying was that if you really buy this, people aren't special. We don't have, and he put it in terms of a soul. Where is the soul? Where is this? But you don't have to put that religiously. You could say, do we have a special spark? Something that burns at the nape of the neck and confers on us the ability to do things that others don't, other species can't. And the odd thing is that if you're any kind of conservationist and you're hoping we don't hit the edge of the petri dish, you end up siding with Wilberforce. And the point that Margulis was trying to make to me when we talked about, wizards and prophets and so forth, is from her, the viewpoint, the differences between them was illusory because they're both, saying that we're special. To say that we're going to save ourselves through technology or say that we're going to save ourselves through conservation, it doesn't matter. The point about saving yourself, we're claiming we're special, and we're not, is her point of view.
And what's your point of view?
Well, I think that this is. Well, I'll tell you. I was really sort of shook up by this because, what is the evidence that we're special?
Look, if my obituary said he was an overachieving mushroom, I'd be okay with that.
And so, I mean, what would, and Lynn died in 2011, so, I didn't have a chance to argue this. So I did think, as I was writing the book, what could I say that would be not just elicit the response from her, oh, you're saying we're special. What about art? Oh, you're special. You know what I mean?
What about art? I mean, that's a good question.
That's going to help us survive. I can just hear her saying, you think that's going to do it? Okay.
It'll help us endure not surviving, maybe.
The spider webs are really pretty. That's going to help them. Yeah, that kind of thing. She was pretty remorseless. And so here's the best answer I could have given her, and which is, cast your mind back to 1800. The world looks politically very different, but in other ways it's profoundly different in ways that are even hard for us to imagine. In 1800, slavery exists around the entire world, as it has since, as far as we know. In fact, the oldest legal records we know of are the Code of Hammurabi, and what it's basically about is when it's okay to buy and sell other human beings. So slavery is a totally foundational institution. It's legal everywhere in the world. It's important everywhere in the world, as it has been since time immemorial. And then in a few decades, in 1800, according to this historian Adam Huxley, I think it's 2 out of 3 people in the world are, in his estimate, are unfree in one way or another. They're in bonded labor. And so he says, then in less than 100 years, this institution that completely dominated human society for as long as we know, it disappears. There are still slaves around. The International Labor Organization says there's 25 million of them or something like that. But in nowhere in the world is it accepted and legal.
Yep.
Similar back in 1800, look at women can't vote anywhere. They can't own property in, I think, anywhere. They can't dump their husbands anywhere. They can't participate in the public sphere. The lists of things, it's easier to list the things that women can do than the ones that they can't do, because it's much shorter. And this, in a few short decades in the 20th century, changes dramatically. Obviously, neither of these changes have fully happened, but it's enormously different. Right now, half the people in this audience are women, and this just would not have been the case in 1800 in some similar gathering. And the subjugation of women by men is also this profoundly foundational human institution, and yet it has changed. So people can change enormously. And I guess my feeling is, and now you're finally answering your question, is if we could do all this, what a drag it would be if we blew climate change. I mean,
all that progress, and then we just run out of food.
Yeah, just how disappointing.
Although it's interesting, and I love the way you frame it. I think you have language in there. If I might have written it down. It sounds like the prospectus for an investment. A 401k. Past successes do not guarantee future progress. What's to say that the erosion of slavery was not just a blip? I mean, you're putting a lot of weight on the last couple hundred years of history as opposed to the previous 10 million.
Wait, Lynn.
I'm channeling her.
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously you're right that that could be a blip. It would be really a drag, but that would be it could be totally a blip. Who can predict the future? But that would be the evidence I have, that we have done these changes in the past. And another one is the decline in violence, and this is something that
Steve Pinker,
and there's some issues with some of his argument, but the basic idea that over the last few thousand years, violence between nations and cultures has declined, I think is completely true, and it's really fallen off the cliff since the Second World War, which is really weird because we hear about Syria and so forth. But every sort of Institute for Peace and so forth that I know of believes this to be true.
So the last time I'll ask you this or a version of this question, given what you've just said about the very hopeful note about the diminution of slavery, of subjugation of women, this is all. Does that guide you to one side or the other of the prophets or the wizard, or is that a sort of specious jump? And if you had to cast your lot with, let me put it this way: if you had to cast your lot with one or the other as a betting man on your children and your grandchildren and your great grandchildren's life, who would you cast it with?
I mean, on which course society will follow, or which sources would be the best?
Well, actually, that's a good question. Both.
Well, the momentum is generally with the wizards. That doesn't mean it has to be that way, but that is where the momentum generally has been.
Is that a good thing?
I'm just stating a fact here. Okay. Now, another way of phrasing this would be, on some level, the prophets are obviously right. The Earth is finite. There's only so many molecules there.
Yeah.
At some point, limits kick in. The question is whether those limits are relevant. If the limits kick in, there's one of the things that I sort of had fun with is an early kind of prophet was this guy named Warren Weaver, who was very involved in the theory of information and so forth, quite a remarkable guy. And he said what people need is what he called usable energy. And so he calculated how much energy falls on the Earth in the form of the sun. And then he said there is room for 800 billion people in the United States based on that.
Wow.
Obviously, nobody would want to live like that. But the point is that what he was saying is, yes, there is a limit, but it's irrelevant for what we're concerned. And what's striking to me, actually, about these debates is how very little effort has been made into establishing exactly what those limits are.
Yeah.
And so I would be much more comfortable answering your question if there was like some group of researchers who really thoroughly did that. And quite in recent years, with the planetary boundaries, people have begun doing that, but it's still really shaky stuff.
Well, let's open it up to questions now. We've got. Please come up to the. You can line up here at the microphone here, and we'll take questions one at a time. And while we wait for people to line up, let me ask you. This is you've written a lot about a lot of technological, scientific stuff. Is there any imaginable scenario in which the answer is migration to the moon or Mars or other planets?
Well, it depends on what the question is.
Well, the question is the solution to the finite resources on Earth and the expanding population.
Well, you can't actually live on Mars. You know that, right?
Well,
you actually have to build a lot of stuff there to be able to live on there.
There's a penny there. I read today there's a penny on there. But anyway.
On the Mars?
Someone dropped a penny there, yeah.
Excellent. No.
Okay.
So your analogy on the petri dish and the multi-organisms that live there compared to the Earth, or G, I forget the exact pronunciation of the term for the total Earth as one organism, doesn't man's and woman's consciousness do away with the formula of the usual species? Doesn't that make us unique as far as consciousness, awareness, and self-determination?
Well, okay. Are you asking me or Lynn Margulis?
You.
Okay. Yes. Clearly, we possess a type of consciousness that, as far as we know, doesn't exist anywhere else. But the question is whether that will make any difference. Almost every species is unique at something. We're also uniquely good at throwing. Did you know this? But that unique attribute will probably not save us. Right? So the question is really, and something our children's generation is going to find out, is whether that does make us special. I have the feeling that if we made it out, through the next century, that even Lynn Margulis might concede that we had something, that we weren't just a bunch of overachieving mushrooms.
Only one mic here tonight. Thanks very much. I really enjoy it. I appreciate the agnostic position that you sort of take on things, and certainly the structure of this prophet versus wizard. And so in that vein, and I haven't read the book or even leafed through it enough to know the answer, but certainly one of the things that is expected to happen in the same decades coming, that climate change will be a very severe problem, and as well perhaps population growth and other resource limitations and so forth. Another thing that's expected is, through technology and perhaps through artificial intelligence, kind of the need for work will decline, maybe even very substantially. So it's one hypothesis is that fact means that with with more people and with more time on their hands and more, that would sort of support the the world that has 11 farmers per whatever unit of production versus 1.5 farmers per unit of production, especially if there are other advantages to the world that has the 11 farmers. In other words, the profit side of thing, or the I hope I'm being clear enough for you to sort of get into this
you're
thing.
saying,
And so do you deal with this in the book in any?
I mean, the point is that that wizards argue that the fact that a smaller number of people can produce so much,
Right, exactly.
is a good thing.
Right.
And what you're suggesting is that if there's not enough work for people,
Enough meaningful work. That's right.
that having a farm like this, with many people in it,
Right.
that would be a feature, not a bug.
That's right.
Right.
Exactly.
And
Right.
If those people can get decent jobs and with decent pay,
Mm-hmm.
and one of the things that's really striking is that the systems that we have, and it's not just us, it's Europe and most other places in the world, effectively subsidize the replacement of people by machinery.
Right.
And so this is a kind of social engineering that's occurred around the world,
Right.
and it could be reversed. As a human decision, it could be reversed.
Right. Okay. Thanks. So is that in the book? Or,
Yeah, I talk about that.
Next question.
I'm kind of curious if you comment on let's say, the negative impacts of immigration. I mean, I was shocked to read that one of the problems we face is, someone moves from El Salvador to the United
move
States.
closer to the microphone?
Someone moves from El Salvador to the United States or from Syria to Germany. There's this immediate, huge increase in the demands of resources from those populations because their standard of living is over a very short period of time increased. So ironically, reducing immigration actually conserves resources over the moderate term, which is kind of a very surprising thing. The second thing I wanted to ask you is that in places like the United States or Western Europe, where people have achieved a fairly successful or, let's say, stable middle-class lifestyle, the birth rates have gone down substantially. So there's been some hope that as the rest of the world, has the opportunity to, a lifestyle of that sort, that the demand, some portion of the demand through increased population growth will be reduced by, the reduction in the, multiple childbirth that occurs. And so, though that does not outweigh the demands of a middle-class lifestyle. So I'm just kind of curious, how you look at those two issues.
Well, the birth rates, have declined all around the world, except in a few places like parts of the Middle East and bits and pieces of Africa. But in Asia, Latin America, they really have fallen, and they're quite comparable to birth rates in the United States. So the sort of picture that is often in our heads of very high birth rates outside of the developed world is been outdated by the events of the last 20 or 30 years. And it is also true that those nations are rapidly industrializing. I mean, the difference between Mexico City, when I first saw it in 1982, and when I saw it again, most recently a couple years ago, is absolutely extraordinary. The amount of difference in prosperity in Latin America, Southeast Asia, China, India is just absolutely incredible. And so it is true that a person who comes from a poor country and goes to a rich country increases demand, just as you say, but those countries are getting wealthy so much faster that that won't be true for very long.
Thank you. Next one.
When you say that sort of both of these paths potentially or theoretically have successful paths from where we are now into a better future, they're different routes, is there a risk that by continuing to fight and not to choose, we sort of just plateau where we are? For instance, the profits preventing the wizards from taking us into the future and we all just kind of crash at our current consumption rates?
Well, that's pretty grim. Sure. Right. I mean, it's the future, right? Almost anything can happen. And we certainly have demonstrated an ability to mess things up. But, then you're getting me into agreeing with Lynn Margulis, right, who would say we won't choose. Right. So one time I was complaining about, the government not doing anything about climate change, and she sort of looked at me and said, well, duh. next week.
Thanks, Mr. Mann. Two questions. So I'm a soil scientist at the University of Maryland, and I debate a lot of these things with my colleagues all the time. What I find to be most true among soil scientists, ag scientists, is that we don't see it as a dichotomy. You made it out to be wizards and prophets. We say we need both. So people say, are you pro-GMO? Are you not pro-GMO? And I would say, and I think most of my colleagues would say, well, we need both. We need organics. We need. So I'm just wondering, I think Borlaug got his bachelor's degree in forestry, as I understand it. So was he environmentally, how did that influence his look on environmental issues?
Not at all, really.
Okay.
And he went to University of Minnesota. And in those days, there's a big forest products industry in the upper Midwest. And what they wanted was people to tell them, how to grade trees and, for lumber and saw timber and to maximize production there. The idea was that these were big tree farms. And he took almost no ecology classes at all, which is strange because, right across over there in Wisconsin, Aldo Leopold was teaching, so Borlaug didn't take soil science at all. He had an incredibly narrow education. And then he became a plant pathologist, which, narrowed it further. What he really did is he went to central Mexico in the 1940s, where he did his most important work, and he saw desperate poverty. It was extraordinarily poor there in ways that we really have a hard time imagining because it just doesn't exist in that many places anymore. 2/3 of the people in Mexico at the time didn't get enough food to eat all the time. I mean, that's 2 out of 3 people. It's just terrible. And he looked at this and he saw these very eroded landscapes, and he said that these people were trying to scratch a living out of it. And he said, we need to give these people better tools. And Vogt actually was in the same place at the same time, and he said, my God, we need to restore these landscapes. Right. And stem from that. And you're absolutely right. Of course we could do both, but it typically seems not to have happened that way.
Well, it's just interesting because, of course, the federal budget, right, $79 billion, non-discretionary, non-defense R&D. USDA gets about $4 billion. So you just wonder, if we were back up at 11%, the way we were in the 60s, what could we do in agriculture that, you could win on both sides? Mm-hmm. So that's really, I think, what the consensus is among myself and my colleagues is we don't have any money.
Would that fix the problem, getting the budget back up,
it's
that
hard
budget back to 11%?
How, in a time when, it's quite commonly estimated that we're going to have to grow twice as much food in 2050 to feed everybody at the level which would be accustomed. Now, there's a lot of arguments and back and forth about that, but that's a figure you hear quite often. And it's really hard to imagine why it's a good idea to cut the funds available to the people who are actually going to have to do this.
Right. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question.
Listening to you, I become even more pessimistic than I was when I walked in the door. And
I'm sorry.
Well, that's life. And I guess my reaction was that, and I haven't read your book, so I don't know if this is accurate, is that what you've described is, faced with what at least I consider a real crisis, you have 2 schools of people who are far less interested in figuring out how to solve that crisis than in how to win over their opponents on the issue of what society they would like, rather than solving the crisis. And it does seem to me that each of these different schools, the way you've described it, has flaws and has virtues and has imperfections, and neither is a sure thing. And yet, the whole way the discussion has been crafted is as pick a side and figure out which side you're on and figure out which side you think has the better argument, when neither of them are slam dunks and neither of them are sure of winning, and both of them have complementary flaws that would lead, that the other one would have advantages to in different circumstances. And it does seem to me that, as an outsider, both are necessary and both some combination are necessary. And it sounds like from your description that that's not the way anybody's thinking about it, or the way I'm guessing the way your book is thinking about it from the way this discussion has gone, which makes me very fatalistic.
Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, I guess to respond, there's no law of nature that says you can't have both. But you'll see when people advocate nuclear power, they typically immediately go on to trashing solar energy, and the renewables crowd immediately goes on to trashing nuclear. That would be a clear example. Or the same thing with GMOs and organics. And so there are these fights, and they've gone on for a long time. And even though researchers, like the person who talked just before you, say that these are not necessary, I'm talking about the public here, and they do seem to be.
Doesn't that imply that the real thing for discussion is to break that down, rather than to say pick a side?
Oh, I don't say pick a side in the book. I'm just trying to say this is what's going on.
We've got a lot of people or at least a few people lined up, but we're running out of time. So this is the last question, and be succinct because we've got to clear the space.
Thanks very much. I just wanted to ask you who would you consider to be the most knowledgeable, honest, and open intellectual heirs to Dr. Borlaug and to Mr. Vogt?
It's interesting. As on the public sphere, as public advocates, or as
in any sphere.
Okay.
Preferably the Earth.
Well, certainly,
for this planet.
as a very influential straight-up wizard is Bill Gates. And there's a whole school of people that are like him, and equally influential, I would argue. Straight up prophet. You could pick people like Wendell Berry. You could pick people like Bill McKibben. There's quite a few people in that realm.
I don't see either of them seeking any kind of middle ground.
True.
Who's working on the middle ground?
Oh, who's working on the middle ground? That's a really good. Well, there's
Charles Mann. On that note, thank you.